morning, and thank you, Tony, for inviting me. I have, I guess, 24, 48 seconds to explain the work over approximately 6 years in this project. It's been a constant source of surprises and amazement, and to a certain extent also frustration and enjoyment, like all projects are, and I'm pretty sure the Shard went through exactly the same thing. I would like to claim also a position on the race for the worst inquiry in London, the one that we went through with the planning consent on Fenchurch. But to me, the most interesting aspect of the project is how pertinent it is to put it in the context of the subject of this discussion, height and heritage. And I wanted to show you a little bit of the history of how the project was generated. From the very beginning, we thought, I personally thought, that it was important to try to make a project that was site-specific. And by that I mean a project that you could not lift from London and put it in Barcelona or in Dubai or in another place. And I thought that in the discussion of this incredibly interesting subject of contrast in a city that it is so highly determined by its historicity, by the fact that the context and the fabric of the town are still not just important and prevalent, but also the trademark of the city as a center for finance and European life. And I thought that while the subject really enabled it, the possibility of shaping the building in forms that were perhaps not really connected to what normally people understood up until some years ago as contextualism, that there was a way through which that contextual relationship could be established without any kind of fake imitation or signals of stylistic coherence. The project was the result of a competition to come up with a design. I should say that at that time, the head of the London portfolio, Mike Hussey, came to the office. The presentations were in the office, and we showed him what we had selected as the kind of ideas that we were going to present. I must say, rather timid and to a certain extent also analytical, if you will. He saw a sketch that I had made and a little model that was under the table where we were making a presentation, and he said, "So what is that?" And I said, "Well, I don't think you want to do this, but maybe you want to take a look at it." And he caught from the beginning the pretty much in the sense of what we were discussing before, the idea that in the process of occupying the skyline, there is a responsibility of the buildings to return something in exchange for it. And the idea was in a site which was in the periphery or on the edge of the so-called cluster, how a building in that position could actually relate to both to the north, to the urban design form that Peter Rees had envisioned, and at the same time have a direct connection to the park and a presence that could actually be self-justified. Many people know these images, but these are the heritage and monuments that are in particular very much connected to the notion of how the planning is evaluated of the building, the consent is evaluated. I also should say that I enjoyed enormously the difficult and sometimes torturous process of having to present innumerable number of times, and also to people that, while probably not being 100% into the subject matter in terms of the design implications of every form that we make, how their concern was legitimate and to a certain extent also important to recover all of this into a portfolio of suggestions that actually shape the building together with the very initial ideas. These constraints that I just went through became perhaps even more heightened by a piece of material that was produced by English Heritage, which was a kind of datum determination of the views from the Tower of London. And even though the building from the very beginning had this important subject to meet, which is its relationship to the context, at least in my view, it really came from this idea that one could actually treat the building not necessarily as a tall structure. I remember many years ago in another talk that I participated, I mentioned to Peter the fact that I thought that most buildings in this town weren't really tall buildings, and I'm glad to see now that I come from New York. Actually, I don't come from New York, but I lived 35 years there. And for me, height and density is a matter of personal choice. So I think that the decision driven by financial or political issues of densifying the city is, on top of being inevitable, is probably the new era of how that could evolve. These are images that I drew precisely for the Enquirer to explain to the people and the lawyers and so on the kind of gestures that the building did to really claim its participation in the cluster. The second aspect of this, and perhaps the most interesting, was that these decisions on an urban design scale are usually misunderstood because they either lack graphic information or have too much of it, but essentially is a process that deals with time. And I think that the public in general has a little bit of a difficulty understanding how these things will evolve in the future. I know the building looks today a little bit isolated in the position. I think that the dynamic and energetic life in London will actually make it be integrated. These are a series of, again, diagrams of the kinds of things that we could have done. You know, a regular extrusion with whatever kind of detailing one could think of it, and how that thing could be shaped in relationship to the street pattern and the views that are really always in a particular non-formal perspective. I mean, it's one of the most interesting aspects of the city is precisely the fact that one encounters buildings that are familiar in and of themselves from angles that are unexpected and from perspectives that are sort of encumbered by other buildings, and define the subject of how contrast could actually become a plus in the discussion of how the city adopts a building typology like the one that we're discussing here. This series of diagrams explain what I think is the number of very simple and really completely unique moves, together with the fact that in the process of generating this idea, the driving force was to free up as much as we could the the public realm on the pedestrian level and return to the city an area equal to the size of the site in a position that actually could not be considered exclusive. So for Tony's question, the building is public at the top. I consider that a unique and significant contribution to the public realm. It has a permanent access 24/7 to the top. It will be run, and there are going to be, I'm sure, important security issues added to this condition. But in the agreement with the city, this is a public park, and but this the project perhaps is better explained in this diagram. You encounter a site, you take advantage of a form that, as somebody said just recently, appears to be a simple diagram of real estate values, and I see no reason why this thing should be an insult. If you have the kind of technological tools that we have today, and I don't claim that this is a unique and permanent solution for anything, even though in many cases has been taking after the fact, that after when we started and published the project. But the notion that you could actually invert the essential typology of a building that goes thin at the top, which is generated by essentially the lateral forces and the wind effect on the mass, in buildings that are historically based on a certain efficiency of how to control those movements, could be inverted, and that somehow the biggest part could actually be at the top and not at the bottom. The decision, once you take that notion in place, and this is not a quid pro quo, but basically essentially is an integral part of the idea, the fact that you could recover that top as something that it is not a ticketed experience, or something that is not a space that that is exclusive in terms of its use, but rather a public realm, as valid as it is the site on grade, is what I put my money on in terms of how that thing may change the experience of visiting London. I am sure the Shard has spectacular views. I can see it across the river every day. I still think that there is some difference, I mean, a welcome difference, in the fact that that you could actually use this room for many more things other than just visiting a spectacular position, viewing position. I mean, this is not an outlook, it's a function room, it's a place where you can go have lunch and just look at the city from the top and give parties and so on. The images are CGIs. I mean, although some of them could have been photographed because the building is in full force of construction. Most of you might have not seen this connection to the Christopher and St. Margaret's Church, which defines one of these sort of leftover spaces that are so remarkably charming and incredibly important in the history of the town, and also in the perception of the town. And this sort of kind of urban park in front of the buildings that remain on Eastcheap, that are part of the development but use undetermined for now, has a face that defines the plaza, which culminates the passage that comes from the subway station. I just wanted to simply show you some of the images of that actually are indicated here on the critical views. The red is the final form, the blue is the original form of the project, and how that process was conducted to achieve the proper proportion of the building in relationship to these views, as well as in relationship to the overall reading of the of the cluster, how the roof, which is this sort of kind of Kew Gardens, winter garden at the top, recognizes not only the viewing towards the river, but also the relationship on this sort of kind of packaging or envelope that the cluster so clearly has. But as I say, at the end of the day, the most important part of the project is this space, which is approximately 4,000 square meters. It has several levels that contains only one for-profit restaurant in the center, but that it has a garden with a series of passages where in this kind of stadium organization you can look at the views from different perspectives. Is pretty much in relationship to this double effect of looking at the cluster also as an example of how the city has reinvigorated itself and has produced one of the most, in my mind, remarkable contributions to the history of architecture in recent times. It isn't a simple thing to deal with heritage in elevation. I do believe that there is a way through which design can contribute, as I said, without creating, stretching the concept of traditional historic buildings in elevation, but rather recognizing the fact that these are objects of a level of specialty which is unique, and nevertheless they could claim to be, as I said, totally site-specific, completely off the town, off that particular site, integrated and contributing one of the most important issues that the traditional historic city has as a drawback in today's urban life, which is the lack of the kinds of degrees of density that are required to sustain the demand and the business of a city, not just in terms of financial or economic objects, but also as a culture, as a product of human activity. Thank you very much.